Hi everyone, this is Jerry. This is round 10 of the FIDE World Chess Championship 2010. In this game, Topalov and Anand enter with 4.5 points apiece, and Topalov with the white pieces in this game opens with 1d4. Anand replies knight f6, c4, g6. This is identical to round 1, where in that game Anand with the black pieces lost in just 30 moves. So he did some homework. He made some improvement prior to this game. Let's see what it is. Knight c3, d5, signaling the grunfeld defense. You kind of have to do that move now, or it's not going to be able to be played. If bishop g7, that would be met with e4, going into the King's Indian defense, and d5 is no longer a possibility. There's too many white controllers of that square, so it's kind of like now or never if you want to play this pawn to d5 move. And it is played. And white captures, black recaptures, e4, strikes at the knight, allows the bishop to come out. Takes, and now bishop g7, developing and putting pressure on d4. This pawn here will be subjected to attack. White in turn will be having to organize their pieces in a way so that they can conveniently defend the d4 square. So from here, bishop c4, just developing the bishop on a diagonal, which is eventually going to have this bishop opposite the black king. Eventually the king will wind up on g8. That's usually not a bad place to be placing your own bishops. Pawn to c5, striking at d4. Knight to e2 defends. The knight can also come to f3 to defend, but that's not good because of bishop g4. The knight will eventually be taken, and as a result d4 comes under that much more pressure since this knight is a defender of d4. So what's the difference from e2? Well, bishop here can be met with pawn here, breaking that pin. So after knight to e2 we have knight c6, development, more pressure on d4, bishop e3, development with defense of d4, castle, and in round 1 what we did see was knight to a5, striking at the bishop. The bishop played to d3, just showing a handful more moves of that round 1 game. We saw b6, queen d2, e5, bishop played here, and a bunch of exchanges occurred where the end result was that white is down a pawn. But after pawn to f4, these two pawns were able to advance in such a way where it was able to influence this black structure. Weaknesses were created, and just 30 moves into the game, Anand ended up resigning. We're not seeing this. We're not seeing this knight to a5 move, but instead the immediate pawn to b6. This is the apparent improvement that Anand made. And now we're seeing queen to d2. Similar to what was already played as Topalov's 11th move from the round 1 match, or the round 1 game. Queen d2 focuses on this diagonal and vacates d1 for a white rook. Bishop b7 developing, and now rook on a to c1. This file is closed, but you can kind of just anticipate it opening up, especially as soon as the captures occurred on d4. So black does similar, rook c8, rook f d1, placing the rooks on what white feels is going to be two good files for the rooks. You could eventually see the c file opening up, maybe even the d file. Pawn takes pawn, and now queen d6. The primary reason, I believe, is to just vacate d8 for the rook. Secondary reasons would include maybe coming to a3, where it seems as though she could kind of hang out there without really being kicked around much. If she ever is, if she does come to a3 and a rook were to maybe play to c3 to attack her, it seems as though she could always just maybe play to a5, and from there she has a lot of possibilities, especially along the 5th rank here. So queen d6, and now d5, strikes at the knight. Knight a5 strikes back at the bishop. And now bishop to b5. When I initially viewed this game, I was wondering what the difference was between playing to b5 and d3. The reasons that I came up with is that if you're playing to d3, you're just kind of blocking the queen and rook's view along this d file. They can't see things as clearly if the bishop's on d3. Another reason is that from b5 you are at least focusing on a hole in the black position that might not always that might not be a bad idea to be doing in your own games, focusing on weaknesses in your opponent's position. Right now c6 is a soft point in the black position. Another idea might be in the form of trying to provoke a weakness. If this pawn moves here to try and kick this bishop around, only now can you play back here, and now this black queen is in an unfortunate position such that she's having to watch over this pawn for as long as this bishop remains here. So this really isn't a position that the black queen is wanting to be in. So after bishop b5 we have the exchange of rooks, rook c8, and now h3 producing a flight square. Currently black still has both bishops on the board, and so when you're trying to decide which color complex to be moving your king to, it's usually not as well. It's not as easy to determine which color complex to be creating. Should you be doing g3 or h3 here? Well, I think h3 is the correct move in this position for the following reasons. It doesn't create any holes in the white position. If you're playing g3, these two squares are holes, and there's also the additional feature that this bishop is already on this diagonal, so you could potentially see it guarding g2. If this square here, after h3, if this square here is to be guarded by this bishop, it's going to have to first at least move to e5 at some point, but this bishop is already here along this diagonal, so I believe it's for those reasons alone that h3 is played instead of g3 when trying to make a flight square. Rook takes rook, queen takes rook, and now e6. What's the point of this move? Well, for as long as this structure remains here, it's like this bishop here is a big dummy. It's just biting on a rock, and so this e6 move just starts to chip away at this d5 point. Knight f4 is the follow-up, just trying to reinforce d5. Takes, and now pawn to f5, still striking at this pawn here, trying to undermine this pawn, trying to make it either move forward or capture, so that the knight will fall, and just trying to chip away at the remaining white center pawn. White plays f3, and this move is made to reinforce e4 so that you can maintain d5, a little domino effect going here. That's why we're seeing pawn to f3. Takes, and now queen to e5. Another possibility from here is to take the knight, but that doesn't benefit black whatsoever. That would run into queen to d2 or even queen to d1. First pinning the bishop, and then you'll end up winning the bishop on the next turn. Instead, it's just queen to e5, striking at the unprotected point in the white position, e4. Bishop back to defend. And now knight to c6. An alternative, if the bishop takes knight here, what could possibly come about is queen check, king f7, queen check, and from here, let's say if the king just plays back here or even here, the piece is won back with something like this, and we arrive at an endgame with the bishop pair versus a knight and bishop. If instead from this position, after this queen plays to d7 with check, if the king plays here, what we could see is a move like h4 threatening to play bishop here, h6 to defend, queen check, and let's say after a move like king here, only now take like this, we could have a series of exchanges on this square, and these two bishops have their eyes on these two black pawns. As a result of this h4 move influencing this h6 move, now this bishop is tied down to defending h6 as a result. So I believe that white would be doing quite well in this position, or at least white is definitely the side which is going for a win here, and it's black that's looking to hang on to a draw. Instead, what we are seeing, instead of bishop takes knight in this position, we just have the knight relocating to c6 with his sights on d4. Bishop a6, trying to deflect this bishop from the defense of the knight. If the bishop is taken here, the queen takes the knight, and although black now has the bishop pair, this queen is fairly deep in the black position. This really isn't a position you want to allow your opponent to have their queen in. There's all four of these squares can potentially be checking the black king at some point, so you really don't even if you're watching over many of them, you don't even want to be in such a position where you're having to cope with all of these possibilities that your opponent might have. So instead of bishop takes bishop, we just see knight d4. There's no time to take the bishop here because of knight e2, forking the king and queen. Instead, we have queen c4 threatening a discovered attack on the black king as soon as the knight moves. Bishop takes knight now, queen takes bishop, and the queens end up coming off, and we have a similar position to that of one of those variations I was just showing before, where it's the bishop pair versus the knight and bishop. And from here, essentially it's coming down to white being better, and white is really the side who's looking to win here, and black's just trying to hang on to a draw. From here, bishop e5, just trying to not even allow white the possibility of getting on this diagonal to sneak around and maybe pick off these black pawns. So bishop e5, king f2, king f7. These are very common moves. We're in an endgame. You get the kings involved. Bishop g5, stopping the king from making use of this square so that he cannot then make use of this d6 square. If he gets there too quickly, he'll end up grabbing this pawn. So white has to be a little bit careful that the black king can't get this pawn on d5. So bishop g5, knight f5. This knight ends up doing a series of moves. It has thoughts of getting to one specific square. Black is trying to just set up some sort of a blockade so that the white king can't really penetrate into the black position. So g4 chases the knight to d6, king f3, just improving the king position, knight e8, and now bishop to c1, just trying to stay flexible. You know, the bishop could potentially be controlling this diagonal at any point. It could come off at this diagonal. These bishops are functioning quite well in this sort of position, this open position. And now finally the knight arrives at its goal, which is this c7 square. From here it's hitting the bishop, and it's also controlling light squares, and as a result it's coordinated quite well with the dark square bishop. After bishop d6, if we just take into account this knight and bishop, just those two pieces alone are already creating this wall right here. And if we start to factor in what the pawns are doing for black, well, this pawn is controlling here. We have all these squares being controlled, and a nice little wall is being formed by the black pieces. So after bishop d6, king e4, just centralizing the king, watching over this pawn here. Pawn to b5, looking to eventually just press forward here, trying to start to control some light squares. This square is already under control, as well as this one. Just pushing forward. Eventually, maybe even these pawns could create a pass pawn. It is a 2-to-1 pawn majority, but those sort of advances need to be taken great care of. You may very well find yourself losing a pawn if you don't push them in the correct way. So king d4. I guess king d4 has thoughts of maybe coming either here or here, just really tying this bishop down to this very square. So pawn to a6 allows this knight to maybe move at some point. You don't want to have your minor piece having to babysit this pawn here. So bishop e2, with thoughts of pushing here and pivoting on the g4 square so that the bishop can then infiltrate the black position. King e7, bishop check, king d7, and now bishop to d2, just trying to, I'm not sure what exactly was accomplished with, that sequence of moves, bishop check, from c1 it went to g5 and now back to d2. I'm not quite sure what was accomplished exactly, probably not a whole lot. Might have been just to take into account time that was on the clock and to meet time controls, but I think just these two these squares for the bishops are pretty good. You know, the bishops are quite flexible from there. So bishop g3. I think black is really just in a position where they're just trying to oscillate the bishop back and forth, and just seeing if white can try and penetrate into the black position. So from here, g5, allowing this bishop to make use of g4, and now bishop check, king to e5, and you really don't want this king getting much further into your own position. So bishop check. If the king comes here, this pawn will end up falling. What we do see is just king to e4, and now knight to e8 with thoughts of hopping it on to the d6 square. This knight is a passed pawn, so you always want to make sure that you can blockade it at some point. So bishop check, king e7, bishop to d6. There are possibilities for the bishop coming around in this direction, grabbing h7. Knight d6 check, king f7, or king f3, and now knight to c4, striking at this bishop, an in-between move, ignoring this threat. And now bishop to c1, and from here it started to, this was really the first position where I started to see where it's likely going to turn out to be a draw. And the reason that I started to see it that way is because I was anticipating these bishops being traded off, and that will occur by force, or what will end up happening is just a draw by repetition, something like that. The point I'm getting at is that after bishop to d6, this move has thoughts of eventually coming here, and this bishop really can't do anything but make use of either of these two squares, and in the meantime this bishop can make use of the square that it's currently on, as well as a3. From here, king e4, a5, bishop g4, now offering the exchange of bishops. This is something which is going to benefit black finally by getting rid of one of the white bishops. This king could be a bit more safe. It could kind of hang out on one of the color complexes. Well, in this case, if you're getting rid of the dark square bishops, the king will be able to play to d6 and sit there for some time without having to move. So after this bishop to a3 move, we have bishop takes bishop. There really isn't anything better if you try to avoid the exchange. This is the point that I was getting at earlier. If you try to just avoid the exchange, what we end up having is just the bishop coming back, and there's really no way to avoid this sort of exchange. So from here, after bishop g4, bishop a3, takes, and now this king will be able to make use of d6 shortly. King e5 threatens to just push here. You really can't allow that. So knight has to come back, give check, and after the king moves away, the king occupies this square here, stops the white king from making use of any of these dark squares. And now bishop e2, knight a3, gets out of the attack and watches over this pawn. Pawn to h4, knight check, king c3, knight b4. Both of these pawns are under fire. Bishop takes pawn. Which of these two pawns to take? Well, knights don't like rook pawns. They don't like having to be on the edge of the board, and or if your opponent has a passed rook pawn, the knights hate those kind of pawns. They have a difficult time capturing those. So let's eliminate those pawns first. That's why we're seeing knight takes a pawn, king b3, knight b4, and now bishop to e2. This is lending itself towards a draw. Knight takes pawn, pawn to h5, and now knight to f4. And if this bishop is to move, what will end up happening is that black will be the one who ends up winning this game. So you end up having to just do a couple moves deep with calculation. You take on g6 first, and after recapture, we see bishop c4, and sure enough, this game ends in a draw, and both players end up with 5 points each going into round 11. So that's all for this video. I hope you got something out of it. Take care. Bye.